patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me in this solo episode, episode 185. If you're new to this podcast, welcome aboard. Firstly, a big thank you and shout out to our dedicated Patreon supporters. They are helping to keep this show going, and so if you're enjoying our content and would like additional benefits, check out our Patreon page in the show notes below. If you haven't already, make sure to smash that subscribe button or sign up for our email list at our website, georgewashingtoninstitute.org. Well, today's episode is a bit of a long time coming. We are going to be discussing populism. We're not just going to be covering all the populism or just the textbook definition. What I like to do is read and discuss an excerpt from one of the early populists in American history. It's very common to hear people who claim they're populists when they're running for office, or people who identify as populist supporters. But is it really true? Should we really believe them and believe the things that they are saying, where they are claiming that they're on your side or that they are fighting on the elite and whatnot? I would argue that there truly is a deficit of understanding of populism. And I like to do my very best in this episode to give you a snippet of what early populists sounded like. Now, we are talking about very different eras, talking well of 100 years ago, but I do think it's particularly vital if people are going to call themselves a populist or any term out there, they should at least have a foundational understanding of that history. My main takeaway for this episode, which I'm going to build toward, is very simple, very much based on Harry Truman's famous quote, "The only history is the history that you don't know." And for this episode, the only populism is the populism you don't know. We can talk all day about how unique our challenges are, and there are certainly unique challenges in this day and age. But as we can see with the history of populism, every issue you can think of is just not new. We can say that technology has definitely changed a lot, but the issues behind technology may not be novel themselves. We can talk about economic issues, could be housing, could be just jobs and manufacturing or skills, education. All these issues can come together, but are these issues really that unique to the 2020s? I like to go deep into a particular part of the platform of James Weaver. James Weaver is one of the most popular populists in American history. He very much set the precedent for other populists to come, I would argue. So let's discuss a little bit about him, and then we'll get into an excerpt from his most famous work that he wrote in 1892. James B. Weaver was born in 1833, and he was from Iowa. And the reason why Iowa is important here, it's not just because Iowa was important for presidential primaries, it's also the fact that he was from a very rural part of the country. There were certainly a number of people in D.C. politics and really in state politics who came from very urban areas. That is still the case for sure. There is always going to be some urban-rural divide in American politics. However, Weaver very much was socialized in the agrarian, rural part of America, and that really helped shape some of his views and his opposition to what he saw was an elite that was very much out of touch. Sound familiar? He did do a number of, I say, honorable things. The first is that he served as an officer in the Union Army during the American Civil War. And I would argue that even as there were quite a few people who served in this Civil War were not, let's just say, not the best we can offer, but nonetheless, for Weaver to do his service, I think that's something to acknowledge. He very much opposed slavery, and that was one of his main values. And the civil rights era of that time, we always talk about civil rights era in terms of the 1960s, but the civil rights era during the time of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, even more down the line, were very, very critical. And the radical Republicans were being yelled. And I would say James Weaver probably had a lot of maybe good beers with some of the radical Republicans because of his stance on slavery. Very much opposed to it, wanted to abolish it, from my understanding. So he was very much already in that mindset, right, of having issues with more conservative or even more moderate members of the Republican Party. He eventually was quite disillusioned. Even though he tried many times to support Republican candidates, he still felt that there's still this elite out there. And he did change quite a few parties over the years. He one time switched to something called the Greenback Party because there was an issue on the money supply system and really just money supply policy. And the Greenback Party, as the name suggests, supported greenbacks instead of the bullion money system that he and many people felt was favoring the rich. And the Greenback Party was very much on ensuring, this is during the Gilded Age, remember, to ensure that we didn't have big monopolies, that we didn't have big companies. That was certainly a problem back in those days. So Weaver is now a more of a, I want to caution myself with left wing versus right wing, because some of the policies that he advocated for ultimately were adopted by also former Republicans, like, say, Robert La Follette, whom we covered in a solo episode earlier this year. But just for the sake of simplicity, let's just say he did support some more left-wing causes. In fact, he did get some backing from very left-wing people, not just the Democratic Party, because remember, there were a number of conservative Democrats at the time. But eventually, he would get backing from labor organizations and other some crazy far left people probably. But there's just this very interesting coalition that he started to build. Given where he started from, you would not expect that left-wing economics or populism would come from someone who used to be part of, say, the Republican Party. But these were interesting times, and there were lots of different changes in how people found their allegiance to a political party based on their ideology. Now, let's get into Weaver in the 1890s. Now, he is running and trying to get himself into the presidential race, and the Greenback Party was not doing very, very well. And so he wanted to become part of a new party called the People's Party, known as the Populist Party. The People's Party, to me, sounds very, very left-wing. I mean, just if it's known as the people, you probably know it's probably not for the people. Just like if you hear the People's Republic of China, well, guess what? The people are the ones who are the worst off in that system. Or the People's Republic, let's say in North Korea, for example. Anytime there's a mention of the people, it's probably because the people are dead last in terms of political and economic success. But anyway, on the Populist Party. This was very much a party that was built on some of the activists that came about in the decades before. So you had the kind of the agrarian side, the farmer side of populism, where farmers really felt that they were not operating in a fair system of capitalism, and that the rich were getting richer and the farmers were not getting richer at all, or not at the same pace. But this, again, was a very different time where you had the Gilded Age. You had a time when, yes, there was some prosperity, but there were also a lot of challenges to in terms of industrial action. There was industrial action that helped derail some major politicians. This was, I think, a very, very crazy time. We often think that they say maybe most recently the early 2020s or going back to the 60s were a crazy time. I would argue that the 1880s and 1890s were really, really crazy. After the Civil War, it was not a peaceful time in many, many different ways. So Weaver is now part of this new party here, and he actually helps lead this People's Party, the Populists. I'll just call them the Populists. And he is actually able to earn the nomination for the ticket, and he runs alongside his fellow vice presidential candidate, James Field, who was a businessman. He's actually an ex-Confederate, which is really odd. I wonder what those conversations were like between the two Jameses. One fought for the Union, other for the Confederacy. I imagine that at some point they just had to use the party to move on from differences, whatever those may be, after 30 years or so since the war. But that's what the party did. The party nominated these two, and again gained a lot of support from again a lot of these more left-wing side of the spectrum organizations, even some who would even later be part of future populist movement. Again, this movement here, the populists, really set the tone. This is probably one of the major populist parties we're seeing as we creep into the 20th century. Now, Weaver was one he served a lot of different roles. He was served as a mayor. He also served as a congressman in the I believe late 1870s for a term, and then from the 1885 to 1889 he served as a congressman from Iowa. Nothing really stands out in terms of that service, but he did write a book called A Call to Action, an interpretation of the Great Uprising, its source and causes. This was something he wrote in 1892 as part of his candidacy. So I just think it's a really interesting piece, and we're going to read an excerpt from it. And I'd like to just point out to you how an older populist movement depicted these issues, and to think, whether these issues are really that populist, or is it just is populism really more just like more PR about the issues that have been going on for a while. There are multiple chapters in this book. Of course, and there's no way we can cover every single one, but I'd like to cover one particular chapter, in part because this is something we mentioned in a previous interview episode, and it's something that also happened earlier this year, 2025, in the summertime. And this chapter is called The Gerrymander. Yes, it is about gerrymandering, and I really appreciate the language here, and I really would like you to listen carefully as to how Weaver is portraying gerrymandering. Now, it is a third party that has no chance of winning, so I guess Weaver could really do whatever he wants here without being too careful on the language, but it is quite a rebuke of the system. And it makes you wonder, is there a populist side to everybody? Is populism not really for a particular class of individuals who highlight this divide between the elite and the common man? Or is it more of a trait and not necessarily a group of people who just call themselves populists? There's something for you all to think about, but let's get into reading of parts of it. I won't read the entire chapter because he does go into some examples, all that. Those are just, again, ways to just back up what he's trying to say. He's also using very powerful language too. So I don't want to give the impression that not everything is necessarily accurate here. But let's get into the beginning of chapter 11, The Gerrymander. Quote, "Abuse of power is the most exasperating crime of the world. It has marred the biography of rulers, stained the history of dynasties, polluted the administration of justice, corrupted the policies of parties, destroyed the tranquility of society, and boldly set at naught the beneficent objects of government from the dawn of history until the present hour. Indeed, it would seem that as man reluctantly emerged from barbarism into civilization, he brought along with him this cherished cruelty, among others, and has since been spending much of his time in the vain endeavor to domesticate his untamable vices, in trying to improve the milk of human kindness by spicing it with venom and mixing it with wormwood and gall. Some men who are physically strong delight in using their strength to inflict injury upon weaker persons. Others who are wealthy in levying tribute upon the destitute. Powerful corporations take advantage of the weak, practically confiscate their property, decree beggary to large numbers of persons, and frequently ordain bankruptcy to whole communities. Such operations strongly resemble the deadly feuds and tribal wars which mark the history of savage races. I'll pause there for a second. That is a really, really harrowing depiction of the political class. Remember, this is the 1890s. He is saying this is about as bad as it gets, it would seem, when all these people are literally taking things away from what rightfully belongs to the common man. And you would think that this kind of language would maybe sound a bit, I'd say not rosy in terms of a good way, but in terms of very flowery language, very, very powerful language. Well, that's what a lot of people were feeling. I don't think it was much of exaggeration, particularly if you're someone who feels like neither of the major parties represent you. And so you would go to someone like James Weaver, who is telling you exactly what you want to hear, but also maybe exactly how you feel. But he says here that this is not the worst. Quote, "But bad as these things are, we are not to look to such manifestations for the most malignant type of modern tyranny. It is when wrongdoers get possession of the state and perpetuate their crimes under color of law that we catch a real glimpse of the diabolism of oppression. It is in such chapters that we find recorded the most heartrending and melancholy recitals known to the annals of our race. The criminal entrenches himself behind statutes, prates about patriotism, and places those who plead for redress or complain of tyranny in the attitude of seditions and disobedient subjects. Official brutalities in modern Russia and English tyranny in Ireland, India, and Egypt will be readily recalled by the reader as marked instances of this class of state-ordained crimes. But we need not go beyond the United States in search for manifestations of this crying evil." I'll pause there for a second. Think about what he is saying about the state of the country. He's saying, don't even think about other countries, how they have it much far worse there, as part of what he's trying to get readers to feel. Again, whether or not you think that the United States is in a huge trouble or an existential trouble, right? This is what he's clearly tapped into, probably based a lot on his own activities and his own party. He's saying that we don't need to look at those countries because it is happening right here and we need to stop it. I'll continue. In our own country, as we have abundantly proven in our chapter concerning the public lands, we have thousands of instances where meritorious and law-abiding citizens have been despoiled of their homes and turned adrift as beggars by the lawless decrees of mere departmental officials. In their haste to serve their corporate masters, it is manifest that they wantonly overrode the plain letter of the statute. Indeed, in numerous instances, it was so held by the highest court after it was too late to restore the wronged parties to their rights. Obviously, you can tell with some of the language here that it definitely sounds more left-wing, right? This is, again, reverting of more on how government is bought by corporate interests, right? This is a very, very common argument made by those on the left, and some on the right too. I don't want to say that it's only a left-wing issue, but there is still that hint of where he's coming from on the economic side of things. And I'll continue here later on in the chapter here. He says, but the abuse of power referred to in the title of this chapter differs in type, though not in character or essence from the crimes just named. The kinship of motive in the two cases is readily discernible, and the difference lies chiefly in the method of procedure. In the above instances, the law is openly violated and redress is denied by ministerial and sometimes even by judicial officers. The political bushranger matures his plans, captures the state, gives his schemes of pillage the sanction of law, and appropriates the spoil. If you refuse to submit, you are not law-abiding. Okay, so he's explaining that that's one type here. And he describes here the gerrymander belongs in the latter category. This vice assails representative and popular features of government, general and local, and seeks to thwart an untrammeled expression of public opinion. Those who profit by the abuses of society deplore agitation, stand in mortal dread of the ballot box, and delight in special statutory favors. They know that many existing institutions will not bear investigation, and they tremble whenever new currents of thought are set in motion. They are liable to sweep existing wrongs and fallacies into oblivion and to replace them with institutions and theories more equitable and humane. Hence, they seek to head off popular clamor, crush out political rivals, and even to drive back the rising tide of reform by special enactments. I'll pause there again. He is very much saying, and I think this is something that moves away from some of the left-wing economic views he was hinting at, and more towards just this general feeling that the reason why people would gerrymander or the redrawing of districts to benefit their own political parties and to maximize re-election is because they are afraid of putting themselves out in front of the electorate. He is arguing that there are people who are so scared. It's like they know they're going to lose if they put themselves out there, so they feel like they have to redraw the districts and get special treatment by the law and by other elites because they can't win a real election. And it's almost like he's kind of hinting this idea that gerrymandering is in a way a form of stealing an election, right? That it's basically attempting to say that, well, we're redrawing because we need to reflect the population, we need to reflect the state, and as you can clearly tell with the rhetoric that we've been hearing from a number of legislators in the summertime, we have now this arms race of people who are saying, well, now we're going to redraw our districts, we're going to redraw our districts, just back and forth, and within the clamor of all of that, there isn't a recognition that any of these people are willing to put themselves out in front of the electorate, that they feel like they need to redraw the districts to, and in some name of, well, demographics have changed. Yes, demographics have changed. That doesn't mean that you should be using sometime in the middle of the decade, right? Remember, the census is every 10 years. So the next one is 2030. It's not 2030 as we're recording this. But as you can tell, I imagine what James Weaver would think of gerrymandering. Again, even as many Americans will disagree with a lot of his policies. Maybe some will agree for sure. But gerrymandering is one of those issues where when a populist brings up something like this, is it really uniquely populist? Or is it that populists do, for better or for worse, and do a good job of highlighting the issue, even if their solutions might not be that great, and actually could be make it even more problematic? Certainly something to think about as we look at populists on the right, on the left today. He continues a bit about, of course, the history. Now he brings up Governor Elbridge Gerry, who is the namesake for this, and the reason why it's called gerrymander is because Elbridge Gerry, as we actually covered in our Sacred Honor series, he tried to redraw the districts, and it looked a bit like a salamander. So that's why it was kind of combined to now be called gerrymandering. And this is what he said here. He said, and he reflects on what happened in Massachusetts when gerrymandering. Now, it wasn't really the first instance of gerrymandering, but that was when it was coined. Okay, he says here, quote, "Since the planting of this bad example in the old Bay State in the early years of the century, its noxious growth has extended into all the states. It has been inveighed against by all classes, condemned by all parties, and anon encouraged whenever the ambition of place hunters or the interests of political organizations could be advanced by the usurpation. It flourishes best when the contest between parties is waged simply for office. It delights in barren and abandoned fields where no attempt is made to cultivate the soil, and where the proprietor gathers a precarious subsistence by trapping and hunting for game. It is just now flourishing exuberantly in most of the states of the Union." Well, he clearly did not anticipate 2025 here, but nonetheless, pretty telling for him to say that the only reason why gerrymandering exists is because people just want the power. They just want to get elected. And he says here, basically explains later in the chapter, and he gives examples, some numbers. I won't go too much into that, but he basically says here, it's like, we shouldn't be surprised that the parties are using this for a weapon, what he calls a weapon of warfare. He says the wonder is that the people who never share in the booty and who are only interested in the general good will from year to year join these political adventurers, sustain them in their depredations, and then foot their bills. And what he says is like the people, the American people, are not going to benefit from this. They will never benefit from this gerrymandering, and yet they will be forced to get along, to follow the party line. I think he brings up an absolutely great point, which is how when the issue of gerrymandering is not just in terms of the practice and the fact that we're not getting good representation. It's the fact that gerrymandering might be as much of an issue as people know about it, and so he's trying to highlight these as, in a way, now pitting both parties against the people. And because traditionally, if you're a member of a political party, you would say, well, the other party is making things worse. He is saying, no, these parties don't care for you. They are bought, as he would argue, bought out by corporate interests, which certainly I think is a big issue for sure in terms of people's concerns about corporations. Now, whether or not those are legal, whether or not it is fair, I think those are out for debate here. But nonetheless, this was a very interesting time, and there were plenty of people at the time who were, among the general public, concerned about the influence of big corporations in government. Did not always agree on the solutions, and I certainly would side more on the free market and whatnot as the solution instead of more of the problem. If one wanted to say, well, there's too much corporation influence, is more government influence really that much better? That I think is something to consider. So I'm going to skip towards the end here because, again, he gives all these examples, and he proposes some method of proportional representation, where he is really kind of going, instead of going to drawing districts, he wants the states to elect these electors and representatives, and just based on the number of votes, the percentage of votes that parties get, that would determine the number of seats that each party would get. So this would be very similar to, say, a European system. I'm not going to comment whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea, because that's a policy opinion of people. They want to decide whether or not that's a good idea. With any electoral system, there's going to be advantages and disadvantages. So what he doesn't get into the arguments for proportional representation, certainly does not address some of the shortcomings of it. But nonetheless, that's what he is proposing here, and he concludes here that the method suggested is democratic in the highest sense, and its operation would make the House of Representatives and the Electoral College representative bodies, and in fact, as well, in theory. So he would say that this method were adopted, this is also early in the paragraph, at the end, if this method were adopted, it would restore the government to the people and sound the death knell to the corrupt use of money in politics. I would argue simplifying quite a bit, because, again, there's a lot more. Now, he does, again, go much more into other issues in the book here, but you can see the vision, right? You can tell why someone like him it was a leader in the populist movement, because, one, he taps into the feelings of people. He also is very good at describing, using language to give people a sense of how it is that they're feeling, and the issues that people feel are plaguing them. That is the sample I wanted to read about gerrymandering. Before we close, just have a few thoughts here, just about populism in general. I don't think there's a single person who would argue that populism is just for the people who claim that they're populists. I think there's always an element of the haves and the have-nots in society. And so if populists were to argue that, well, they're the only ones who are populists, I would disagree with that, because everyone, one way or another, feels like they have something or they don't have something. And so populists are not unique in their appeal to both sides. Again, what they might be able to contribute is perhaps the PR side of things. And whatever you think of, say, people, let's say, on the far left from Mamdani, on the right, say, to Donald Trump, these are people who clearly have a way to communicate, and their communication methods are distinctly a lot more effective. The big question is, it's one thing to highlight the problems or to be good at highlighting the problems. Are the solutions the way to solve those problems, though? And that, I think, I would argue, is where populists start to falter, where, in part because I think inherently, populism has to live on this gap between the rich and the common man. When you get outside of that realm, and you start talking about solutions and whatnot, I would argue that because you were talking about solutions that would narrow that gap, or at least conceptually would narrow that gap, I would say that when you put things into practice and you realize that maybe problems are a lot more complicated, or that bureaucracy is harder to solve, or that governance is harder to implement, and some of those populists might start to realize that maybe their ideas are not as feasible. It's one thing for someone to say that I'm going to freeze rent because we have a housing problem. Well, it might sound really good on the campaign trail, but when you're governing and you're implementing all this, or when Wall Street or other businesses, whatever people think of them, they do have a lot of money, a lot of capital, because that's how a capitalist system works. Whatever you think of them, they're going to have an influence on the effects of policy. Is in terms of rent freezes, is that really abiding by the principles of of America in terms of a free market and competition? I think a lot of people would say no, but that's just, again, one of the questions we need to ask when we are given solutions. On the other side, we have people who argue that we need to bring back manufacturing, and tariffs are a way for bring manufacturing back. And I would argue there's a lot of people who would argue that, particularly in the recent years, that we need more manufacturing. Right? That now, in terms of what we manufacture and all that, that's certainly a debate. But when one says, well, we are implementing tariffs and we're making other countries pay for it, is that really the case? Right? Is that really true? Is it really true that other countries and their consumers are paying for tariffs? I think a lot of people would argue no. And then this is where, again, I just bring back to this dichotomy here between populism in terms of highlighting the issues and populism in terms of the solutions. And my view is, I think in history, and includes people like James Weaver, includes La Follette, includes others maybe in recent years or in past decades. While there's certainly some platform or some policies that have been adopted from their times, although albeit much later, were those policies maybe the right solutions or the right medicine for the problems? And I think that record is a bit of a mixed bag, and we need to, as part of our understanding of populism, we need to see what it contributes. We can't just go along the lines of saying, well, populism is always great. We need to always have this kind of rhetoric. We always need to tap into people's feelings. It is important to connect with people, but again, to say something on purpose just for the sake of echoing what someone's feeling might not always be the right answer. It might be that sometimes you need to say things that they might not want to hear entirely. Now, you don't want to insult them, but you do want to be frank with them and say, this is really what is going on. But it's all about the other elements of campaigning, of governance, of showing up, of not missing votes because you're on vacation or something like that. You know, they're just things that can, and again, make people feel like they don't need to be everyone does not have to be a millionaire. Not everybody has to feel like they need to work for Wall Street. What they feel is they need to feel heard, and they need to have some element of faith in institutions. They need to have some faith in expertise to carry out good governance. And populism is a bit of a mystery. It still is. But once again, the only populism is the populism we don't know. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to check out the links down in the show notes below. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.